In the 1920s U.S., the fabric of culture was torn and rebuilt half a dozen times as new forces, both external and internal, brought massive change in every direction. After the disastrous disillusionary war and peace, the U.S. turned towards itself at the expense of many groups. New grudges and issues grew from the events of the war, and the wish for Americanization of immigrants carried on after attempts to do so during the war. The traditional life of Americans was interrupted with new ideas, while old morals were overturned in the face of a newly uncertain post-war generation. These splits affected everyone, including women and African Americans, and included cities and their changing populations.
The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia brought about both communists and a pure hatred for communism in America. When the Russians abandoned the war, they were seen as traitors, and their new system, linked as it was with socialism, produced a great Red Scare throughout America.
This scare was utilized by everyone from the KKK to the government to big business to draw support and assault dissidents. Especially important was the assault on labor businesses, claimed the closed shop was the Sovietism in disguise, and proclaimed their own open shop to be the American plan.
Meanwhile, the government attacked all sorts of dissidents under the guise of communist raids. Criminal syndicalism laws made it illegal to even propose violence as a path to social change. One of the major leaders in government campaigns against the Reds was General A. Mitchell Palmer, who targeted about 6,000 suspects in his raids. Many people caught this way were deported, often back to Russia.
In the 1920s, the golden door of immigration in New York began to close. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the Immigration Act of 1924 shut out massive streams of people, especially from Southern Europe.
This decreased flow actually proved helpful in many ways, especially to labor. As new people stopped entering, those left behind were slowly forced to Americanize, and eventually this melting pot broke down many walls that had prevented laborers from working together.
Many disapproved of this process, especially pluralists such as Horace Callan, who argued that America was best when different groups worked together but maintained their own cultures. Cosmopolitans such as Randolph Bourne claimed that Americans should be a transnationality, a result of cross-pollination between different cultures.
The ideals of history began to collapse, even as they had seemingly great victories. While the old guard represented biblical morals, fundamentals, and temperance, the new generation of modernists stood opposed, or at least in suspicion of, all of these historical traditions and leaders. Prohibition is arguably the last great stand of traditional morality. Its failure demonstrates that these values had no place in a disillusioned post-war America.
Meanwhile, in Tennessee, a small town became the center of a major stand for scientific realism over biblical literalism. As a teacher was put on trial for teaching evolution, the entire world watched Dayton, Tennessee, to see where the decision would fall. Unfortunately, the decision never quite fell on either side. The teacher was fined, but the fine was overturned.
This decision could not have happened in earlier times, when everything felt towards religion. For the first time in centuries, religion was forced to shape itself to the rest of the world. Some chose to not, and these traditional fundamentalists lost some of the realism that was required for belief to hold for most.
These splits between the past and present greatly affected women. The development of a new woman greatly opposed the Victorian requirements was one of the greatest changes of the day. So-called flappers were the distinguishing feature of the 1920s. They wore their skirts short and their hair even shorter. They began to wear makeup and smoke in public. They took jobs and political power. They somewhat unintentionally demonstrated Sigmund Freud's theory through the expansion of their sexual freedom.
Much of this change was due to advertisement. As the powers of propaganda learned in war transitioned to consumerism, women were targeted, and products were linked to sex, freedom, and feminism.
African Americans also felt the forces of modernism. Racial pride developed, and jazz music and the Harlem Renaissance produced a brand new black culture across America, which fed into the mainstream. Marcus Garvey's United Negro Foundation supported African American businesses in an attempt to level the playing field. Many of these projects failed, and Garvey was eventually deported after a conviction of mail fraud.
Meanwhile, an old force reared its head against change. The Ku Klux Klan had faded, but roared back into strength in the 1920s. The new Klan was based on a somewhat fraudulent pyramid scheme that encouraged continuous recruitment. This Klan was not only racist, but also anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, anti-Jewish, anti-communist, anti-evolution, anti-birth control, anti-pacifist, and basically stood as a gathering point for everyone with an issue to get behind.
This whole era was stirred up by the growth of cities and suburbs. Suburbs splayed out as the gas car brought easy transportation to all, but many in rural areas continued to despise the cities, stealing their sons and daughters. However, people continued to move there, especially African Americans. This Great Migration moved 6 million blacks from the rural South to northern and western cities. They were often propelled by racism, and job prospects were much better in the cities.